for their homes. The city, after the hurricane, took over 3,000 occupied units offline with the destruction of the 4 largest housing developments. And here in New Orleans, we call those the Big Four. So we had over 3,000 units that were taken offline. These were units that people were actually living in, and they did not have the ability to come back to those units. Now, if you are living in federally subsidized housing, you are low income, right? And so we had all this housing that was taken offline with no plan about where to put those folks who lived in those units and called them home. As of today, only 670 of those units have been replaced. Further after the storm, we saw a lot of discrimination against low-income women who in this city are predominantly African-American due to Section 8 discrimination. So landlords were placing ads saying no Section 8. And some of that we know was done intentionally to keep African-Americans out of predominantly white communities. And even if that wasn't done intentionally, we know that those kinds of policies had a discriminatory and a disparate impact on African-American women because the majority, the overwhelming majority of Section 8 voucher holders in New Orleans are Black women. Here in this city, 99% of voucher holders are African-American, and 83% of those voucher holders are women. So because of the lack of available Section 8 housing options, Section 8 housing became concentrated in far-flung neighborhoods of New Orleans and sometimes even in neighborhoods outside of New Orleans. And anyone who lives in New Orleans knows that the public transportation options for people who don't live close in are lacking. The lack of options for affordable housing for African-American women in this city after Katrina led to desperate choices, including women who were being forced to live in housing where they face sexual harassment. And I'll wrap up. I just want to share very briefly that in my organization, we definitely saw an uptick in the number of women that we were representing after Katrina who were being sexually harassed in their housing, meaning that they were being forced or pressured to trade sexual favors in order to remain in their housing. We represented a woman who was extremely courageous who came to us. She moved back to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina because she wanted to come back to her home. Because of these issues that we just discussed, she had limited options for housing. She was on disability and could not rent an apartment due to the lack of affordability and access that she had. She decided to rent from a landlord who would not require a credit check. And that landlord made sexual advances toward her the whole time that she lived in that property. She felt unsafe, and she was also subject to harassment by the maintenance man. She then began to try to make her own repairs to her apartment because she did not want to have to call the landlord and face the continued harassment. And then when she complained and when she said, "I won't take this anymore," the landlord increased her rent. I'd also like to note that we are aware that undocumented women are particularly vulnerable to sexual harassment in housing. Their lack of legal status often leads to a lack of options, and we see housing providers and landlords that take advantage of that lack of status, and many times those women are afraid of police intervention. They're afraid of asking for help because they know that that can lead to deportation. And so I have a lot more to share, but I will end there and hope that I can provide some more information through questions.
My name is Dr. Adrienne Dixon. I'm a professor at the University of Illinois. My area is critical race theory and education. And I'm a former teacher here. My family is from here. And for the last 7 years, I've been doing research on school reform in post-Katrina New Orleans. And so I want to start my commentary giving a shout out or homage to one of our mamas in the community, one of the elders, Mama Jennifer, always starts her introductions to volunteers who come to the city to build homes and give people light bulbs. We don't know anything about light bulbs or recycling. And she always starts it out by saying, you know, Louisiana is a slave state. And I think it's important to say that in part because when we talk about this kind of grand experiment of school reform, we have to think about the context of this being a slave state and what it means to experiment on people who weren't able to get their consent.
That's right.
And so, so the people who were impacted by the experiment could not have happened until we got rid of what they described kind of sterilely as human capital. But that human capital were actually Black teachers. In New Orleans before the storm in 2004, 2005, There were about 4,000 or 7,000 teachers, almost 4,000 of them were Black teachers. Nearly over 80% were Black women. So it's about 2,000, almost 2,200 teachers. The data now is difficult to track in part because of a lot of obstructionism by the state, and I'm using that word specifically because the Department of Ed has been sued by newspapers, by researchers for not releasing public information. I asked for the race and gender data for all teachers across the state of Louisiana in every parish from 2003 to 2014. It took 2 years to get that data because the popular perception is that Black women are absent, right? So that we don't see Black teachers. If you go into classrooms, you don't see them. And so I wanted to look at this empirically. I could not get the data. It took 2 years, and I finally got a huge file. It's complicated because the charter schools don't necessarily track that data. So all we have is what we have for Orleans Parish, which is, again, a little complicated. But you would have to buy into, in order to accept the narrative of the experiment, you would have to buy into this narrative that Black women were complicit in the undereducation of Black children. And that would make, then it would sell this idea that we need to come in and save our children. So we lost 80% of our teaching force for Black women. The governor, if anybody was here in Louisiana, you recall that if you retired, and most of the teachers had to retire and draw retirement, if you were retired and collecting retirement, you couldn't also collect another paycheck that paid into the retirement system. So retired veteran Black teachers had to choose between collecting their retirement or living on a paycheck that may or may not have been similar to what they earned before Katrina. The only choice, charter schools are opposed as a choice, the only choice has been charter schools, and the charters have been able to negotiate their own salaries. So we don't actually know what teachers have been made, or making in charter schools, but again, it put a huge burden on a significant population of Black women who made up a substantive amount of our Black women class here in the city. I'll close there.
Thank you. So for our first round of questions, I want to ask Terry, Katie, and Renisha if they have any questions that they'd like to ask.
Yeah, I wonder if you, I think it's very appropriate to call this economic violence, and I wonder if you have any sense of a tie-in with health effects on the constituencies that you work with.
I'll get around to this.
I have a question for Ashana. So, one of the strategies of My Brother's Keeper initiative, and a lot of the strategies that we see to support what is happening within the schools is mentorship. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the way that mentorship may be problematic for Black women and girls specifically.
Questions?
Oh, okay.
Hi, Kashana, I was hoping that you could tell us more about the scope of housing, especially affordable housing, as it stands now, nearly 10 years later.
Any other questions?
So should I start with the last one?
Anyone?
Oh, okay, well, I'll just quickly address try to be quick, address the scope of housing discrimination. So within the state of Louisiana, we see the discrimination just every which way you could possibly see it, right? So on individual levels where we have landlords, these are all cases that we've worked on, all investigations that we've conducted where we have landlords that we might have a Spanish speaker with an identifiable accent call, and that person is told, well, you need to have someone who speaks English call us back. Or we might have a tester, mystery shopper call who has what might be an identifiably African American speaking pattern or name, and that person may be told, well, we don't rent to your kind, right? And then when the white testers call, and these are quotes, okay, this happens, and when the white testers call, they don't have that same experience. We also see a lot of systemic discrimination on the larger level. So governmental entities, for instance, most people in the room may be familiar with the St. Bernard Parish litigation that our office moved forward, where we saw landlords after Hurricane Katrina in St. Bernard Parish, which is an overwhelmingly white parish next to the Lower Ninth Ward. That parish was over 90% white prior to Hurricane Katrina. And the parish government became concerned that African Americans who did not have access to public housing in the city of New Orleans and other rental housing would try to move to St. Bernard Parish. So the parish government passed a law that said that you are a homeowner, you could not rent your home to anyone who was not related by blood to you. Now what that means in a parish where 90% of the homeowners are white, that means that they can only rent their homes to other white people, okay? And the Fair Housing Act, any which way you look at it, says that is unlawful and that is illegal, okay? And so this is a governmental entity, a local municipality that has made these statements on the record, and it's clear what their intent was. And then when that ordinance was struck down, the next thing that they did in St. Bernard Parish was decide to place a ban, a prohibition outright on any multifamily housing being built, again, because of the fear that you would have affordable housing developments built and that low-income African Americans would move into the community. We also continue to see post-Hurricane Katrina punitive domestic violence, zero tolerance policies, and I'm very proud and happy to say that the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center, together with some very courageous legislative leaders, has done tremendous advocacy together with our partners for the past 3 years to build a coalition to work to pass legislation that would prohibit landlords from evicting tenants, primarily women, who are the overwhelming majority of domestic violence victims, from being evicted because of domestic violence. And what we were seeing is that women would come to us with leases that they had signed saying that any police calls could be the basis for eviction. And so that means that if you called the police or if your neighbor called the police because they heard an assault happening, then you could be evicted. There were also many leases that indicated that participation in a domestic violence event could lead to eviction, and that meant participation even as a victim. So we were seeing clients who were assaulted, had gone to the hospital, and then came home to an eviction notice because of the abuse that had taken place against them. And so I want to make very clear when we're talking about domestic violence in housing, we know that African American women experience intimate partner violence at rates that are 35% higher than their white counterparts and 2.5 times the rate of men and other races. And so these kinds of policies certainly had a very disproportionate impact on African American women in the city.
I want to speak about the health, the impact of health. So for the shift, so New Orleans now is predominantly charter. There still is an elected board. It's shrunk. But kind of the impact of that is, one, private negotiations of employment contracts. So teachers don't know what the salaries are. For the veteran teachers, many of the charters offer health insurance, but the cost is almost prohibitive. So the benefit of the ACA is that, parents can still cover their children. With the younger teaching force that's been recruited here, many who are under 26 years old, health insurance wasn't really a concern for them. So the high cost of health insurance in many ways was prohibitive for veteran teachers who simply could not afford to teach anymore because the salaries may not have been competitive. We don't know that information because it's private. And they have to sign confidentiality agreements. There's a lot of fear for many of the veteran teachers that either if they wanted to go back and teach, if they speak out, they can't. I'm working with a group now to try to collect stories, and it's shrouded in a lot of secrecy. We don't tell people when we meet. We don't say when we meet. We don't publicize our meeting list because they're very afraid of being found out and not being able to get employment otherwise. But in many ways, the health insurance is, and for aging teachers, that's a concern, and that they don't contribute to retirement. So again, it almost doesn't pay to teach.
Well, I want to answer that mentoring question because mentoring in itself is a good thing. Girls need mentors, boys need mentors. But when we put it as the answer to systemic problems, so you're gonna mentor me into living wages. You're gonna mentor me out of racism. You're gonna mentor me into health. You're gonna mentor my unjust school into a just place. The problem is not with the children. The problem is with the system. If you correct the system, the children they're gonna learn correctly. So yes, mentoring is a good thing, but if we're putting all of our money onto the children, blaming the victim, while the system gets to be crooked, unjust, and violent against them, then that's a problem. And so, yeah, we need to work on it. And I want to answer the health question too a little bit, because when you come back and you are negotiating all of these contract jobs, and they have all these new nonprofits opening up, and don't get me wrong, I like people from the Bay Area in New York. This is New Orleans. We're a port city. We welcome you. And we want a place at our table. We want health insurance for our children. We want a living wage. We are the experts on our experience. Hire us. It's hard. I did not go to Harvard. But I know a little bit about my community and my people and my children. And so yes, stress, not being able to feed my kids, not being able to pay rent in my own city, not being able to fix my car. Yes, that has a direct impact on my health and the health of my children. So, I'll speak.
So we have another round of questions.
We work with a coalition. In fact, we worked with the coalition that worked on the domestic violence housing ordinance. But this coalition, which is of a lot of organizations that are women who are informed to a certain extent. They've been working a long time on things like civic engagement and important issues, Medicaid expansion, which would allow health care for more women, equal pay and paid leave and paid sick leave and paid maternity leave. Our struggle, there are a couple of things. One is, I think you would agree, but I would like to hear that a lot of these problems would disappear with the power that financial equity would bring. And so that's some of the systemic problem. We work on these issues across the board for minimum wage, living wage, higher minimum wage. Nobody should be working minimum wage. And equal pay at least, although of course that intersection with race, you don't want to just catch up to black men because they're making less than white men. And so we're comparing at 66%, we're the lowest in Louisiana. So my question to you, and we are struggling also to get even enlightened people to recognize that that's the problem. It's not just the mentoring, it's this systemic problem. So do you have any advice for coalitions working to do what would actually change those systemic things?
Another question for Dr. Dixon. You talk a lot about the changing landscape within education in New Orleans, especially around the pushing out of Black educators, which predominantly we know were African American women. What do you see as the emotional toll on Black girls in those schools with the absence of those Black women in the classroom?
I just want to add to that, it's a similar question about the impact. Where are African American girls finding role models if we've taken away some of them?
I kind of had a crossover question that connects the education piece to the housing piece in terms of how criminalization of our students can affect housing options.
Well, I was going to ask one, but there's so many good ones on the table. If there's anything left for me at the end, I'll ask them. So take it in whichever order you like.
Okay, I wanted to jump right in, and I'm going to start with the criminalization on African American girls, because what a lot of people don't realize, because the charter schools are their own districts, they have zero tolerance policies which criminalize almost anything. So you can bring a comb to school with a comb with a point on the end to take down braids,
and that can be considered contraband. So can Midol, so can Tylenol. And if your child is arrested, and they can be arrested at school for things that are not illegal on the street, but illegal in the school, you may be kicked out of your mixed income development because there's an arrest on your record. Because your child accidentally brought a comb to school, or because she had cramps and she took Midol or gave some to her friend, and this is happening. That's one thing. When we talk about what can fix the system, I don't feel like it's rocket science. We need to have a community accountability board that has gone through trainings, that understands poverty, that understands racism, that sits and looks at comprehensively our different systems and comes up with things, you know, real world things to fix them. I mean, is it rocket science that we should have books in schools and teachers that are from the city that the children are from, that are rooted here? Is it rocket science that we should actually look at how big, what things cost in the city in order to determine wages? I mean, a lot of these things are not like, you know, maybe we should have a rent ceiling. Maybe the city should come up with a policy around, you know, rent control. Other cities have it. I mean, we claim to be a progressive city, but we do not have enough progressive policies. We can look at, there are other models on how to do this, and we can do it, but we have to look at it, and it's gonna hurt people's feelings. Some people's feelings are gonna get hurt, but for the overall good, we have to do what is the right thing for all of us. And I'm not saying, yes, we should have a new person to the city on that board, right? We should all have the same trainings, we should all learn the same information, but no, if you can't have a room full of, and I'm about to call out City Hall right now, you can't have a room full of young white transplants making decisions on how programming should run for the whole city of New Orleans. That's not okay. I'm sorry. I mean, and foundations, some of y'all need training too. So as much as I want to some training, like for your managers who are on the ground creating programs.
So there is an absolutely undeniable link between the criminal justice system, right, and lack of access to housing for Black women. So we know that in New Orleans and across the country, Black women and our bodies and what we choose to do with them, okay, are over-policed. And we're going to hear a little bit about this later, the ways in which Black women, including Black trans women, have been punished for the decisions that they make about how to feed themselves and how to take care of their families in terms of laws that criminalize and target sex workers. But here in the city, we find through investigations that very often housing providers use criminal background checks and policies, right, to keep out African American women and African American people in particular. And so whether it is a prohibition on any arrests, period, which for any African American person who came up in New Orleans, we know that many African Americans have experienced some contact with the police, and so to be an adult in this city who has never even been arrested is a pretty big accomplishment. And so we see housing providers who not only ban anyone who's been arrested, but also they may be enforcing different standards. Okay, so when we send testers in, and they may have similar criminal background histories, because we want to find out whether the white person with the misdemeanor will get in, but the African American with the misdemeanor won't get in. We want to find out whether that happens, okay? And what we have found doing that work, which we're currently in the midst of, which we have found, and here comes the shade, we have found that oftentimes the landlords are telling our white testers that they will not even run the criminal background check, okay? And that is something that is just a completely on its face different policy for African Americans and for white testers. And so we know that they are not even holding white potential renters to the same standards to which they are holding African Americans. And so it's important to understand and recognize the ways in which over-policing and these unjust laws work to keep African Americans out of housing, but also the ways in which housing providers use these rules and laws as a pretense for keeping Black women out of housing.
On the piece about role models and the emotional cost, I don't know that we actually don't have a lot of that's not a question we've asked empirically to look at what the emotional cost is. In some of our research, kids have walked out of school. Ashana and I work with some high school kids who walked out, so we're just not gonna stay here, and they organized. And one of their, we worked with them to come up with a list of demands, was issued, and the kids' name, they said they want teachers who look like them. They want teachers who know the city. And the funny thing in kind of New Orleans, these kids said, we want teachers who are old enough to be, who are older than our big cousins. So you know, in kid language, many of the teachers are, you know, 22, 23, and that's fine, sort of. But what the kids are asking for is that, yes, they want veteran people, veteran teachers who know them, who know the city, who can guide them, and they're not getting it. Some of the kids have been empowered enough to walk out. The kids asked us if they could form a union. Is there a union for students? And this all came from people.
That's sweet.
It's encouraging on one hand and it's heartbreaking on the other.
So ladies, I just want to pose perhaps a question around which you can give us some final comments. I think one of the most significant ways in which you've helped us think about some of the issues that women of color here are facing is that it helps us to challenge the narrow way that we might see vulnerability across lots of different issues. So for example, we have a conversation about sexual harassment and domestic violence, but that conversation about sexual harassment doesn't place it in the context of a rental market. We only think about sexual harassment in terms of employment, and that has consequences for the ways in which Black women experience sexual harassment, right? So that, as well as some of the consequences of domestic violence. We know that there are all sorts of risks that African American women face, even in thinking about calling the police. They're more likely to be killed themselves when they call the police than anyone else. And now you've helped us think about there's another level of risk as well, that they might actually lose their housing security. So broadly, we know that from some of these experiences, we have to think much more broadly about issues that we tend to see as gender. I'm asking now whether many of the experiences that you've helped us think about also challenge us to think more broadly about how we've thought about some of these issues as race. So for example, in the educational context, there is an effort to hire Black teachers, but that's just male teachers, right? So there's assumption that we don't have to worry about Black female teachers. So that seems to suggest that we have to think more broadly about how African American teachers, male and female, are increasingly missing. And I would say the same with respect to income supports. Many of the current programs support income development only for men, not for women, as though families are not completely dependent on women's salaries. And also in terms of housing insecurity, there are particular ways that race discrimination plays out against women that ought to be part of the racial justice agenda. So if you could give us a sense about how some of the things that you've seen should help us rethink a racial justice agenda to be far more inclusive of women and not simply focused on the way half of us experience racism.
Well, I want to talk a little. I would love to talk a little.
No.
Hello? Okay. Well, so I wanted to talk a little bit about, I could go all day about education, but the discrimination girls are facing in education, we've always had two different cities, but never had, in my memory, and I'm 40, has the education looked so extremely different, and especially for girls. I mean, you have girls that are patted down, asked to pull out their bra as they walk into school. And then you have the schools, when you talk about, if they have at least 45% Caucasian children, that does not happen. That does not happen. Those schools look different. A lot of times they do not have uniforms. They are not patted down. No one walks them to the bathroom and then times them at 2 minutes and goes into the bathroom and knocks on the door. That is what's happening to little young Black girls. They're being told that everything about them is wrong. That you have an attitude, the way you move. They can't have a headache. they can't have a bad day because it is some kind of race is covered. Because you're being disrespectful, you're sassy, you're too, you know, they're placing these racial stereotypes on these little girls from the age of like 10 and 11. I do advocacy in education, and you should hear some of the stories. You have little girls who can't even go to the bathroom to change their menstrual pad, and they will be punished and suspended because they called their mother to bring them a change of clothes. That would never happen. So a little Caucasian girl in a Lusher, or Benjamin Franklin, or Autumn Montessori, and we can sit here and pretend that's not true, but we know it's true. They're not having the police being called on them because they brought my daughter to school. They're not having the police being called on them because they accidentally brought a cone to school. That is definitely race and gender, and if we don't start having a conversation, it's only going to get worse. And we deal with 5 high schools that walked out because they were tired of being discriminated against. They were tired of not having certified teachers, books, toiletries, and being just treated with decent respect. And so that's why those kids walked out. Yeah, it's definitely race and gender.
So I think following along on that theme, that it's just important that allies, right, make sure to listen to and believe women of color when they tell you their stories. And that sounds so easy, but it is not always happening because we are the experts on us, okay? We know what happens to us. And so oftentimes, you know, well-meaning, whether it's black men or white women, really don't have sort of the full view, really want to help out, and in doing so, it sort of erases the experience, right? And so it's important in thinking about fair housing work and working with clients who have been sexually harassed. It is important for me as an African-American woman who works in this field, and I know that other black women who work in the field have done this advocacy as well. We need to be prepared to explain, and we need for our colleagues to understand that there are some black women who are being harassed in their housing because they are black women, okay? So it is because, whether it's fetishization of their body or what, sometimes the harassment and the experience is happening to them because they are black women. And we need to create those spaces where women of color can share their experiences. We need to create those spaces where trans women of color can share those experiences. We need to not tell other people's stories, and we need to not have expectations of what their stories are, but we need to understand and allow for women of color to be able to share their stories. And I think that more than any sort of one thing that can be done, is something that will help to really work us to break down these systems of oppression.
So nationally, black teachers only make up about 7% of the population. So let me make parity in terms of whatever our numbers are supposed to be in general. And of that 7%, black women are only 4%, basically. So the difference between black men and black women in teaching nationally is only a percent. In New Orleans, those numbers don't really matter anymore because teachers have been displaced and replaced anyway. The energy is around, the discourse is around bringing in black men, and that would be helpful. But we need to bring in all teachers. Our kids, the kids who walked out actually didn't make a gendered analysis. What they wanted was teachers who looked like them, teachers who understood New Orleans, teachers who were older than them. They wanted, and so that what they called for were veteran black teachers. That's what they wanted. I think the energy to kind of increase the black male population, as it pertains to New Orleans, doesn't really address the issue, and it's around this rhetoric that Ashana brought up in terms of mentorship. What are we mentoring people in if the context is unhealthy, unsafe, and toxic?
Please join me in thanking